Right, and I will straight start with hopefully everyone being able to see this. So if you have questions, of course, you can post them in the chat. I will do my very best to stick to the time somewhat so that there is some chance to answer them. If, however, time is too short, I will still have a look at the questions. As long as you leave your email address, I'm always happy to email you back and answer them. If you think of questions after the session, not an issue at all. Again, my email address is going to be on the slides later, or I can post them in the link later on. You can always get in touch with me and just post your questions. Okay, so I would say let's jump straight into this. So thank you again for everyone being here. And I just wanted to briefly mention that this session is actually based on a project that we do thanks to SIETAR UK and a really nice group, as you can see on the right-hand side, of volunteers, where we put together a training project and other elements to support volunteers in the UK who help refugees. And if you have interest in this, to join this committee, then again, you can email me, but also here's the email if you have questions or for anything that's going to be covered. Clyde, if you would do me the favor to also post the email in the chat, that would be fantastic. Okay, so let's start with where we are with culture. So this is a definition by Helen Spencer-Oherty and Peter Franklin from a chapter from 2009. And it's just so that we kind of start on the same page. Of course, there can be different understandings of culture. When you talk to a sociologist, they have a different opinion than an anthropologist versus a psychologist. But this is something we can fairly agree on. So Helen went through the really much effort to put together a long list of different definitions and trying to find how they actually fit and how they are compatible with each other. And the main things we can say about culture is that it is manifested through different types of regularities. Now, what that is, I'm going to talk about in a second. Let's just keep this in mind. So culture has something to do with regularities. Of course, it's associated with social groups. We all know that. We talk about national cultures, team cultures, organizational culture. It's always a group of people we refer to. Then, of course, why we are all here is culture relates to and has an effect on how people interpret behaviors. What do I consider as politeness as a German migrant living in the UK is not what maybe a British national considers is politeness. Queuing is for English people, not for Germans. So these are things we have to keep in mind when we think about culture. So when I mentioned regularities, what I will talk about today are different forms of regularities. So we can think of culture as coming up as perspectives. So these can be implicit attitudes we can't directly see or observe. They're usually unconscious. We were socialized in them. We don't even question them anymore. We're so used to it. So these can be values, what we or our group thinks is important in life that guides our actions. There also can be self-construals, which is a form of personhood or how we relate to others. Another form of regularities is practices. These are more things we can actually see. And two concepts I'm going to touch on is tightness and looseness by Michelle Gelfand, and the concepts of honor, face, and dignity. And you see that there are some aspects of culture perspectives that are gray, because I doubt we have the time to cover it, but I still included a slide with some references and ideas if you want to look into these, because I think especially with the analytical versus holistic thinking, people might be interested in that. So culture manifests through different types of regularities, and these can be either universal or specific. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's just do this. This is something we really need to keep in mind, because what I will focus on is the universal aspect. So we look here at a nice picture of a snowflake. we can look at the snowflake in all its detail. It's like, oh, okay, how did it start here? Okay, it's very dense here, then it becomes a bit lighter. Then we have all these lovely branches reaching out with some spaces in between. What could this mean? How did the wind blow? Maybe the temperature dropped. So we can literally see by looking at one snowflake what its individual journey was. So we look at something very specific. We call this an emic perspective on culture. So usually it's a cultural insider, someone who's part of that cultural group, who tries to really pin out what is specific about it. So that's usually what anthropologists would do. They really dive into it, saying, okay, this is what cultural elements look like here. These are what regularities are. Now, what I will mostly focus on, and what a lot of, so we get stopped by talking about snowflakes. And the main idea of that, we can look at culture in a very specific way, which I was just going to refer to as an emic approach. So John Barry was kind of lending this term out of the linguistic literature. So here again, the purpose is we really want to understand culture in detail as an insider. But that's not what I will talk about. In psychology, we often look at, well, what are dimensions, figures, things that all social groups that we can think of are actually sharing, and maybe they're just vary on it. So for here, we could think about, oh, those snowflakes, well, they are all hexagons. So that's something in common, but they might vary in size, or they all have little branches, but the amount of branches that each snowflake has is different. So you see, a dimension that all of them have that is universal is the type of branches, or that they have a certain size, but they vary how big or small they are, or whether they have a lot of branches or not a lot of branches. So therefore, this is an attic or universal approach to culture. So we look at it as an outsider, and we try to uncover universal laws or dimensions, things that we think exist in all social groups and we can compare people against. And that is what I will talk about. Yeah, so when you have heard of research by Stuart Hall or others, that is not what I'm going to talk about. I will talk about the very much, here is one dimension and we can use it to compare other cultures against, at least so far as psychology tells us we can do that. Now, another thing, however, we have to keep in mind with all the different theories I'm going to talk about today is, please remember that just because a person is part of a whatever cultural group we want to look at, and most of the work focuses on national groups, on country states and so forth, that it doesn't mean that every individual shares these components. Yeah, so I love this example with, do you show up at the arranged time? Is this important for you? Well, again, I'm from Germany, so I would say, well, for people from my group, this is very important. Yeah, very, very much important. You have to turn up at the arranged time. If not, there's going to be sanctions. But is it important for me? Well, you know, it depends sometimes on the context, who are going to meet. So there will be variations to what extent individuals incorporate and stick to the behavior that is being shown they should have with regard to their group. So again, we keep this in mind, that dimensions and concepts, and I will stress this, what is conceptualized for the group level, we can't use it to explain individual level phenomena. I know there's a lot of researchers trying to do that, but we call this an ecological fallacy. It's simply wrong. You can use it, whatever is at the country level, as a dimension to explain how a country might react to things like what is their gross domestic income, what is their innovation level, what are the extents of their trademarks. There are things that a country can produce, but it's not really used to understand individual behavior per se. But of course, we know that we are individuals in a group. So of course, it can affect us, but we just need to keep those levels in mind. So giving you the first example, and I guess what all of you will be familiar with is we talk about culture, especially values, existing at the group or national level by Geert Hofstede. I assume most of you, if not all of you, have heard of him. If not, well, now you do. So Geert Hofstede was a Dutch social psychologist. He used to be working for IBM, and this gave him access to a massive existing data set about employee satisfaction across all IBM settlements. And this is on this basis is how he published his first book, which was called Culture's Consequences, International Differences in Work-Related Values. And the main focus of all of his work was creating national level cultural value dimensions. And with values, we mean things that are desirable, transit-rational, so not depending on context or situation, that surpass these restrictions. These are goals. They're very important. So one value might be more important than another, but they serve as guiding principles. So for instance, I'm a vegetarian. I value egalitarian attitudes towards animals. So therefore, I act according to it. I give money to charities for animal protection. Again, I'm a vegetarian. I try to, in general, have more environmental friendly behavior. Yeah? So guiding criteria in life. Most of you will maybe have seen this. These are the famous 6 dimensions, which 4 were the original ones introduced by Gerd Hofstede of this original data set that I just talked about, and 2 were later on added, which is by Michael Harris Bond, the time perspective, the long and short term, and we have here the restraint versus indulgence, which was added by Minkov. So when we just look at all of these dimensions, power distance, makes sense. How high or low is a country group on thinking that people are equal by birth, like this is something we accept as a group, or being unequal is something we accept. Yeah, people are born into a hierarchy. Whether a society can tolerate uncertainty. For example, Germany is always being said that, oh, they can't really tolerate uncertainty. This is why there's so many rules and information and structure, similar to Japan. We have individualism and collectivism. So to what extent is an individual can be understood as part of a group? We'll return to this a bit later. We have the concept of femininity and masculinity. So to what extent does a society or cultural group stress power and competitiveness and see that this is what we should thrive for as a group, or collaboration and cooperation? With time perspective, we have future or long-term orientation. So we put our efforts into this direction, into the future. Or whether it's now we look into the past and deal with problems by learning about the past, and we consider only short-term goals. The last one about indulgence is to what extent, for instance, would we allow children to just express themselves, walk around free, be loud, scream on the airplane. And we say, well, that's okay. The biggest difference you could say you see here is when maybe you see families in Spain or in Italy, where children can often be more free, walk around, be louder, whereas in other societies, maybe they will be more restrained. Now, everything I told you, you might be like, oh, great. So what does the UK look like? Well, this is where the UK would be posted. And you already saw that I put a big red X through it, because I really don't want you to remember anything that I just told you. Because what we know now is that there's a lot of critique we need to consider when we look at Hofstede. And if you want to look at all the issues with the theory and the operationalization, so how data was collected, how things were calculated, there's a lovely long list of shortcomings presented by Meg Sweeney. And there's actually a later paper from 2009. So I'm just going to tell you the main components why we really need to step away from this classic Hofstede concept. The one is that, as I mentioned before, he used a pre-existing survey. He didn't develop the items or the scales or based on theory. That stuff already was there. From a positivistic point of view, which is the research paradigm that he followed in creating those dimensions, that's an absolute no. It's not theory driven. You can't just take the data and try to match it to what you think is right. The other problem is that from the 66 countries he had data from, the size of how many people are in each group varies massively. So for example, we have about 11,000 German participants and only 58 from Singapore. Do 58 people represent a whole national culture? And on top of that, actually from those 66 countries, he only used 40 to create his 4 dimensions. Why? What happened to the others? So it's a bit weird. The biggest criticism, of course, we can say is data is from IBM employees. How on earth do they represent a national culture? So taking all of this on board, actually one of his previous collaborators had a look at this and thought, well, then maybe let's have a look at this with representative data so we can try to overcome all of these shortcomings. And this is work done by Minkov, which was published in 2008 in several journals, which was quite a bombshell within cross-cultural psychology. He used data from the World Values Survey, and he also collected representative samples from in additional countries. And so we have, at least statistically speaking, representative data of countries now. He also looked whether the measures are reliable and valid, so whether we can really measure these dimensions. And what he found is that from all those lovely 6 dimensions that I just told you about, only 2 were replicated using better data and a better analysis technique, which was individualism, collectivism, and flexibility versus monumentalism. So what is individualism versus collectivism? Here is the idea of every society, every social group faces the challenge of how do I integrate people? And individualistic cultures shows that it's a rather loose tie between individuals. It doesn't mean that people don't have friends. It doesn't mean they don't love their family or that they don't help them. But it means that this types of society that are individualistic, the single person, what they think, what their goals are, what their drives are, is more important. It's more important to be voiced, to be followed, to act accordingly than the goal of the group. Vice versa, collectivistic cultures, people are being born into a very strong and cohesive in-group. It can be family, it can be another type of social group. It doesn't necessarily have to be a national group. But it means that you have a lifetime of loyalty towards this group. And we can try to see it as a beehive. So for a collectivistic culture, each individual person would represent a working bee, working together to make the hive function. Yeah, so rather than the individual's bee's needs, of course that bee has individual needs and goals and strives, but they're not as important. As a whole collective, you work together to keep the group functioning and you stay loyal for the group, and the group goals are more important. So I guess you all can see how this can have influences on how societies function and how they make decisions. I think Corona and the pandemic and its regulations is the best example. Do we value individual rights? This is what I want to do. I don't want to wear a face mask, so we don't have regulations as a society. Or is it, no, the group is more important, we need to cut back? And I'm not saying that, for instance, the UK didn't react in this regard and didn't have these discussions, but there are some cultures who value the group response more than the individualistic response. Now, to flexibility monumentalism, the main idea is that when a society is high monumentalism, it means that stability and consistency are being supported. And this is also encouraged through helping others. So a really strong hospitality culture, because it gives you pride. Yeah, so this kind of dimension is about what gives people pride and self-confidence at a group level. And just to make more sense of it, maybe you can just read through these statements and see, well, where do you think the UK culture, or if you're not from the UK, where your culture might be fitting? So I like to help. I rarely agree to help. I have unique good qualities. I'm an ordinary person. I like to compete. I hate to compete. Good things come from my actions. Good things are luck. Or I'm always the same person. I'm different at home and outside. So again, the idea of a monumentalism is you are a monument that is stable across time and situations, that gates being proud by helping others through hospitality culture. Whereas flexibility is you need to fit into the context. You always need to adapt about what life and situations might throw at you. So where does the UK sit? Now here we have monumentalism flexibility. So here on the right-hand side, countries were scored high in flexibility. On the left side, low and monumentalism. And we have collectivism and individualism on the left side, so on the y-axis. So we have here is the higher it goes, the higher countries were scored in individualism. And now, probably unsurprisingly, we have the UK quite high in individualism. Yeah, so this single person needs and goals we value and are quite important. Now, one thing, if you are a trainer, for example, you might be surprised by is that the US actually dropped in individualism. Actually, the US can be now considered as individualistic as, for instance, Japan. And so there is this ongoing misconception that people in Japan are super collectivistic and the group is important. But actually, we see strong movements here. And it's same with China. Yeah, they're not as high, but they're also not massively low. For instance, when we look at countries like Nigeria or Kenya. And actually, when we look at monumentalism and flexibility, what this dimension did and why this was such a big bombshell is that it helps us also to see differences between East Asian countries and South African and Latin countries. So to make it more clear. And we can see actually those that are the highest in individualism is North Europe. We have Scandinavia, yeah, the kings and queens of individualism, not the US. As you can see here, here's our little Anglo islands. Whereas East Asia is more in the middle, but very high on flexibility, fitting into context. Whereas Africa and Latin America is very high with regard to this hospitality culture, seeking pride out of stability, being consistent across situations. Now, what about individualism and collectivism at an individual level? Because I guess you all have seen that, well, this might actually happen for individuals as well. This is not just a group phenomenon. And researchers try to address this. So this is work from Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama, who looked into how people explain their personhood. So how do I, as an individual, construct myself with regard to other people? And they propose two different construals. One is the independent, that is more likely and is encouraged to be developed when you are growing up in an individualistic society. That is, well, I'll show you actually later. Whereas an independent self-construal is more accessible, again, more encouraged within collectivistic societies. It doesn't mean that people don't have an independent self-construal in collectivistic societies, but it means that when you grow up in such a society, one or the other way of how you understand yourself is more encouraged. Therefore, you're more likely to have it and express it and use it when you make decisions in your life. An independent self is therefore what we, from that research, thought is Western. It's individualistic. It's understood as you're separate. Yeah, you can see myself. Yeah, I'm here with all my lovely skills and my goals. I see my parents, they're really close to me, but they're not part of who I am. Whereas when we think of an interdependent self, the idea is that it's connected to others. Yeah, others and their characteristics are part of who I am. And therefore I change according to with who I am. Yeah, so how I am with my family or maybe with my mother might be very different to with a friend. Of course, this is true in individualistic societies as well, but how the self understands themselves is simply different. Now, however, as you probably could see, the work from Marcus and Kitayama is quite old, and there has been a quite important update to it. The main problem was with the measurement. There was no good scale for it. If you try to measure it, it's just quite impossible. The other thing is that, and probably you all are aware of this anyway, and therefore you might just agree with this, it's just simply too simplistic. There is more than just East versus West, which is what an independent versus an interdependent conceptualization does. Yeah, it's always this obsession within psychology that we just want to have the West versus everyone else. But everyone else is not one cohesive group, and so is the West not, whatever the West might constitute. So there we have some problems. Also, what is not being examined is how people, in what ways are they actually independent and interdependent? And I'll show you what I mean by that. So Vivian Bengolis published this work in 2016, fantastic, big samples. As you can see, we have 16 nations in the first study, 55 cultural groups, and 33 nations. So they made a distinction as well with what is a cultural group by language, religion, and so forth, as well as nation states. And the sample is a lot more diverse. Yeah? So we have students, but we also have adults. So it's not one organization and their employees across the world. Now, to show you what they found is actually that there were 7 dimensions of how people could construct their self, which is how you define who you are, whether you see yourself as more different to others or whether it's more important to be similar to others. How you experience the self, whether it's self-containment or whether it's the connection to others. Yeah, it's like, oh, you know, I'm by myself, that's completely fine. Or is it more, no, if you want yourself, it's more whole if you are with others. It's making decisions. Is it self-directed by your personal goals? Or is it you listen to everyone else? What is the context? What does everyone else want? What does the group want? Is it looking after oneself? You rely on your skills, your abilities, your goals, or is it the dependence on others? You know, help is going to come, resources will be given and shared. Is it moving between contexts? So is it doesn't matter with whom you are, in what situation, the main features of how you define yourself are going to be the same. Yeah. Maybe this is a bit confused, this construct, but just think about this. I know that I think in the British culture, it's more often that if someone reacts like very outgoing and loud and happy in one context, and it's a completely different person in another one, you might say, oh, you know, they're two-faced. Like they're not really real. Like, who is this person? Why are they like this in this context and then completely different in another one? Well, there are cultures where this is completely normal, and that's not considered two-faced or being unauthentic. Then we have communicating with others, whether it's about self-expression, my values, my opinion, or whether the harmony of the group and others and how they think about what I have to say is more important. And again, this deals into the last dimension, which is self-interest or conflict in interest in conflict, whether it's that your interests need to be pushed through in a conflict situation, or whether the commitment to others is more important. So again, here, just to give you an idea, you can maybe in your hat or on a piece of paper, think where you would fit on the scale yourself. So difference versus similarity would be you like being different from other people. Self-containment versus connection to others is your happiness is unrelated to the happiness of your family. Then we have you prefer to do what you want without letting your family influence you. This is self-direction. You prefer to rely completely on yourself rather than depend on others, self-reliance. You behave in the same way even when you are with different groups of people, consistency. You prefer to say what you're thinking, self-expression, very strong UK pattern I've seen. Self-interest, you value personal achievements more than good relations with the people close to you. Again, these were found on an individual and group level. So we can talk about this with regard to nation states as well. So you might be interested in this then. So this is where the UK is, GB, 2 different samples. So we have similarity and difference. Yeah, do people want to be different from others? Is this how they understand themselves? Big surprise, the UK is quite high on this one. Yeah, so this is something we value. Versus we have some countries down here. These are European countries, or you can see here, sorry, I moved this. So this was a differentiation between European, by the European Union, ambiguous European countries and non-European countries, whereas some score down here where the similarity to others is a lot more important. Similar when it's about commitment to others and self-interest. Surprise, surprise, commitment to others. It's exactly the opposite what I just said. Haha. So on the samples that they had on a national level, actually committing to others is being seen as more important as who we are in the UK than serving self-interests. Now, to make things just more complicated, let's talk about a different concept of values, which exists at the individual and at the group level. And this is introduced by Professor Schwartz, a very nice guy. If you have any questions about his theory, you can always email him. Just put his name into Google. I promise you he will respond pretty fast. He's always open to have questions answered. So he published his first work in 1992 about the basic human value theory. And as you can see, big samples again. So we have 41 samples of school teachers, we have university students, we have 12 samples from adults from different occupations, and even samples from teenagers, from adolescents. Now, this was the original work. Again, there's lots of free resources on this, also how you measure it from the European Social Survey. Again, there's the link. All of this, the recording and the PowerPoint slides are all going to be available to you, so you don't need to take any notes. So there is very recent data on this. You literally can look at where countries are currently scoring on those dimensions, even longitudinally. So they do it every 2 years. So these are the 10 originally basic human values that Schwartz conceptualized. So just to pick a few out, so we have, for instance, you probably can't see this up here, benevolence and universalism. So this is when you personally find it's important in your life to be honest, to be helpful, to value wisdom. It is something that guides you. So maybe you like learning and listening to other people to learn. Inner harmony, social justice. And they're completely opposite to the priorities of achievement and power. So this was this new thing. Now we have a relationship amongst values. All the concepts I showed you before are quite individual, whereas here we have a relationship between the values. So opposite to valuing social justice is, for instance, well, I'm ambitious. I want to influence people. I want to be successful. I want to be wealthy. I want to have power over other people. Yeah. So if that's your value, it's very unlikely that in the same situation for the same content, you also value equality. You can't have both. Either you have power over people or resources, or you seek justice and equality. So this is what I mean with those relationships amongst values. So there has been an update to this. So now it's not 10, it's 19 values. This resource actually from Schwartz 2012 is publicly available. The link is later on in the presentation. So again, as you can see, it's this whole idea that values relate to each other. Yeah, so opposite values are positioned opposite to each other. And this has been found again and again in research that there really are, you can do analysis where you plot where values and value scores should end up. And this is exactly what comes up. So one thing I wanted to stress is, for instance, you can summarize these whole 19 values in higher order values. And something that might be very interesting to all of you, if you're trainers or you work with refugees and asylum seekers, is that as an individual, you can either value yourself self-protection or anxiety avoidance, which is fed in by conservation or security values or power, versus growth or anxiety-free values. Yeah, these are opposite to each other. So what we found is that people who have a growth, who value growth values, so self-transcendence and openness to change, or universalism and self-direction, if you look at the individual ones, are of course the ones who are very open to immigrants and refugees, who are completely open to the idea of multiculturalism, whereas those who are on the self-protection spectrum, it's new stuff, it's change, it challenges their power status, it challenges the status quo, traditions, their sense of security. That is all the perception of being threatened, and it's encouraged by endorsing a value of self-protection. So there's lots of research that has seen this association. I'm just stressing this because if you do training, for example, or if you engage with refugees, just keep this in mind. If it's for training, there might be people in your training who endorse self-protection. So if you then tell them, oh, you know, there's a new culture, it's new, it's exciting, they will shut down even more because it's against what motivates them in life. The same when you talk to refugees and asylum seekers, if they are more on the conservation scale or the self-protection, then going to them and be like, oh, look, this is completely new. Look at UK culture, express your opinion. They might shut down because that's not the personal value that they endorse. So instead, maybe try to link at, okay, you know, you value tradition. Well, here's a tradition for us. Yes, it's different, but you approach it from there's something more you can share that relates to stability. Now, at the country level, it exists as well. So not just at an individual level. And we can see some links if this pops up, if it lets me. So what Schwartz actually found in follow-up work is that at a country level, there are 7 dimensions. So we can talk about national cultures either by stressing embeddedness, so social order or obedience, hierarchy, so you have to be humble and you have to respect authority. You can think about it in terms of mastery, so ambition and daring is being supported. Or maybe it's a social group culture or national culture that stresses effective autonomy. So pleasure, having excitement in life is very important. It can be something like intellectual autonomy, so broad-mindedness and curiosity, or egalitarian values, so social justice is very important, or harmony, so unity with nature and striving for world peace. There we go. So this is roughly how they project. So just again, to stress again, we have values that exist for each individual. And here is how they relate to when we look at the group level, just to stress again that these things are different. So where is the UK? Haha. Big surprise, it's in the effective autonomy. So hell yeah, the UK likes to have a drink at the pub and enjoy life. That is something that, at least to the values measured by Schwartz, seems to be strongly endorsed in UK culture. So we talked about perspectives. Now I will move on to norms, which are forms of practices. The first one I want to introduce is by Professor Michelle Gelfand. She is in the US at the University of Maryland. Again, really big study. Was a big thing in 2011. I remember it very well. I was just finishing my master's degree or starting my master's degree. It was a 33-nation study, and it went back to this idea of what are norms and can we use norms to think about culture. So what did they do? They collected data, as I said, from 33 nations. Half of this was female, so half of it is students, but that means, again, that they have a more or less mixed sample. So it's not fully representative, but still better representative with what we started with Hofstede's original study. So we can trust the results a little bit more. Now, norms, the idea is that norms are cultural practices, and they exist of 2 poles. So a norm is about having codes of conducts. How are you allowed to behave in a certain context? And what happens if you violate this code? Yeah. So how many rules are there and how many behaviors are that are allowed at a certain situation? And if there's only a limited amount of behavior that is allowed in a situation and you break it, like you do something weird in that situation, will you get sent into prison? Will you maybe get executed, or does nothing happen to you? Tight cultures are the ones, therefore, with strong norms. That means only a tiny level of different behaviors that are allowed in a certain context. Let's say we think about a funeral. Are you allowed to wear whatever you want and play whatever music you want? Is that allowed in your social context, or is there going to be actually harsh penalties that might affect you? Yeah, so that's meant with this. In a tight culture, you can only wear black. You have to play sad music. If you don't do it, you might end up in prison even. Whereas in loose cultures, you can dress as a clown and play happy music. Maybe the person who passed away was a fan of clowns, and it's totally acceptable. Or you might dress in any color you want. You might have a completely different funeral than going to the cemetery. It's all allowed. Yeah, there's no one certain code of how the behavior script needs to play out. And of course, you can imagine that this has massive implications on people's life. Yeah, so here's an example way of how they measured this is asking, do you think in the UK, there are very clear expectations for how people should act in most situations? That's just as an example. And this is where countries scored. So just you can see the UK, it's like, oh, it's more towards the tight level. Of course, it might vary with regard to context and situation. So this is obviously averages. But in comparison to other cultures, so when we think about Brazil, yeah, I mean, makes sense, more loose, maybe the US, okay, maybe Hong Kong. Then we have here the comparison with US and China. So classically, we would say China is a much more tight culture. There's an often context, there's only a certain number of behaviors that are allowed, versus the US, where you have a broad variation of behaviors you can do. Now, if I can't see the chat. So if you currently sit there and like angrily hammering into the keyboard and saying, this is nonsense, I'm totally with you. Because Michelle Gelfand didn't stop there. She started to collect more and more data. And of course, there are variations the deeper you dig. And here, for instance, of the US, we can see that the blue states down here, so Texas, for instance, are tight states, whereas the green ones, so we have here California, and here we have like New York, Massachusetts, and so forth, are also more loose states. And I mean, think, yeah, that makes sense, because the idea is in loose cultures, not just as more behavior allowed, that means immigrants are more welcomed. It means that there is usually less domestic violence and general violence. You have a lot more access to resources for minorities. However, on the good side, maybe for tight cultures, is that there is more order, more respect, of course, to rules. But of course, there's also harsher punishment. So death penalties are usually the standard in tight societies, for instance, in the States. But it's the same with China. Yeah, we can make the same differentiation when we look at Chinese different regions. So we have areas, for instance, around Shanghai, which are being seen to be much tighter with regard to their norms. So again, what behaviors, how many different behaviors are allowed in a certain situation, a certain context, and how harsh the punishment will be if you deviate from the expected behavior. And you can see regions closer in the middle of the country, or Guizhou, is actually more on the loose spectrum. Yeah, so of course, we can't be as simplistic and just say one country is like this and the other one is like that. But we try to do this to make sense of people who have been socialized in a certain way. Now, coming to the last concept that I wanted to introduce you to is a different idea of norms. And maybe you have heard especially of face culture. Maybe you also have heard of honor culture. I don't think that most of you have heard of dignity culture. So what this concept does is it tries to compare different social groups and individuals with regard to what gives them self-worth. What is the source of your self-worth? And let's look at dignity. Dignity culture as a norm concept is the idea, for instance, the UK would belong to this, but also Germany, is that the worth of myself comes from my intrinsic assessment of who I am, what I want to achieve. I have been born with this right of self-worth. Yeah? It wasn't given to me. I have been socialized into belief that I had this right from birth. Therefore, it can't be taken away. Therefore, people in dignity cultures strongly strive for individual rights. Again, a nice example is now in the pandemic, yeah, how we kind of try to tap around individual people's freedoms versus trying to protect the collective. And it's actually an interesting study of how you can insult people from different cultures. So if you want to insult someone from a dignity culture, it's usually you attack the individual rights. You tell them, oh, your car, your ideas, your freedoms are going to be shortened. That is going to cause outrage in dignity cultures, because that is something we see as where our self-worth comes from and how we have been socialized, where it comes from. In face cultures, however, so often East Asian countries, the idea is that our self-worth would come from extrinsic assessment. So we depend on other people's idea, and it depends on what our social status is in a social hierarchy. Where am I amongst group members? Yeah, with like how much respect towards the elderly, towards the young, someone's senior, someone's junior to me. Can it be taken? It can actually be taken away from you. So it's not a birthright if you don't fulfill your duty, your obligations as part of your hierarchy status. Yeah, so you're not adhering to the virtues that are associated with your social status in your hierarchy. And you cannot just claim face, but others have to be willing to grant it to you. And of course, face can be threatened. I think you all have heard this. With face became mostly associated when, in the West, I guess, when you feel embarrassed, it often associated with face. So if you try to speak a new language, you don't do it very well, you don't want to embarrass yourself, but you also don't want to embarrass the other person you're talking to, because you think that by you not understanding them, they might look bad. So you're saving their face and you're saving your own face. Then we have honor. Honor cultures is about that your self-worth can be claimed. It actually has to be claimed. So again, you're not being born with it, but it's not down to a social position, and it's not about that you have to fulfill obligations or duties and that you can't overstep certain rules in a society. It's more about it has to be cultivated through a great reputation, like through a social standing of yourself and your family. That's why the family, and especially in honor cultures for women's status, is so important. If that is damaged, so again, if maybe this is bad, I'm telling you this, but if you want to insult someone from an honor culture, of course, it's you try to damage their reputation towards the self, towards the family, and often towards female members of the family. So honor can be lost through shame and humiliation. There is no one main creator of these concepts of face, honor, and dignity. And these concepts might pop up in all sorts of different theories in linguistics, as well as in maybe even in sociology and in anthropology. But some of the researchers I wanted to stress are Loing and Cohen, who put together a nice summary, as well as Isa Uskul does fantastic work, especially on honor culture. Now with this, what we can't talk about today, so I don't stretch the time too much for everyone, is the World Values Survey, maybe in another webinar, but if you're interested, there is the link. It explains all the concepts and values on the page really well. They have a recent data set from last year published. So again, you have data sets, I forgot, I think every 4 years or so. So longitudinal data, it's fantastic. It's really great and free to use. Then there's the Globe project, which was from House and colleagues. And this was 2004, I think, if I remember correctly. Again, with great data set, publicly available, with different countries. They massively focus on the Hofstede dimension, so maybe be cautious with this, but they also found some additional dimensions of how you can just think about in what culture people have been socialized in. Again, doesn't mean they adhere to those ideas, but maybe they're more accessible to them. Another cool concept is social axioms. This was introduced by the late Kwok Loing and Michael Harris Bond from Hong Kong. And these are 5 concepts of belief, social cynicism, for instance. The reference are on the next slide. And another cool concept is analytical versus holistic thinking. One great paper on this is Nisbet, who summarizes quite well, but there's more recent research on this. So here are some of the references if you're interested in this. And again, you will have access to all of this anyway, so you don't need to write anything down. But I wanted to stress, if you struggle to get access to academic articles, here's what you can do. Go on OSF. This stands for Open Science Framework. This is one platform where researchers start to publish papers before they actually go through print in an academic magazine or journal. So before it's nicely formatted and all of that stuff. Maybe some things also have not been corrected. Maybe still some typos are there. But you can have free access to preprints on that side. The same with PsycArchics. It's the click on it, you have a full mass of research, openly, free, accessible. These are all preprints, so just before they went into production to be printed as part of an academic journal. If this doesn't work, simply check the author's webpage. If they have one, they're allowed to share their papers on their website, and very often they do. There's also an academic Facebook, which is called ResearchGate. And again, this is where usually researchers share their preprints. If it's not there, you can just email the author or write them on ResearchGate and say, I love your work, share it with me. And they very likely will do that. So don't get or shy away if there's no access to literature, because there's always a way to get access to preprints. And that's this.
Thank you very much, Katharina. You managed to squeeze all that into the much shorter time. There were various comments and questions in the chat, particularly about, how relevant is it to have such universalist views, and it just leads to disagreement and annoyance and so on. That was posted by one particular person who's now actually left the session.
Yeah.
There were not so many very specific questions, actually.
I can comment on this. I guess this is a burning question for everyone. I have two comments on this. The first one is we try to understand culture from various angles. Psychology does their best by approaching it mostly from an ethic approach. That will give us some ideas of how people have been socialized. It doesn't give us the whole story, of course not. But it's some way of how we can make sense of people's experiences and where they might be different. And as I mentioned before, we are very much aware that nation states are very often bad containers of culture. So just because you're in the UK, it doesn't mean that someone from Scotland is not different to someone in the south of England. But even further, areas in south of England, so if you go to a big city versus to a small town, there are massive differences as well. So people are usually more individualistic when you live in a city, whereas when you live in rural areas, you're more collectivistic. Because you depend on more people, yeah? You know your neighbors, whereas when you're in a big city, it's less likely you know your neighbors. And most of the time they might be a bit weird and you don't want to know them because it's more people. But it also means you have to be more open-minded because there are more people and you need to kind of share the space with each other, which again, vice versa, is not the case in rural areas. So what's the point of having then such universal perspectives? Again, it gives you an idea of what kind of socializations people might have experienced. So how you have grown up with influence of your parents, your friends, the media that you have perceived. These ideas of individualism or collectivism are all being portrayed, for instance, in media, even in school texts. One of my colleagues at Brunel University, she actually looked at how school texts are formulated. And even there you can see that my needs, my skills is stressed in American school texts, even in math questions, versus we and group-oriented goals and questions are more stressed in math texts in Japan, for example, even though there was not such a difference anymore. That work clearly was a bit older. But just to say that different values can occur in multiple ways. And this is why we can make use, to a certain extent, of universalist approaches. Long answer, I guess.
Yeah, well, no, it's a very big question. The other questions were very specific about how can one country be this or that, and that referred to things right at the beginning. So I think it's not really relevant to go back over that right now. So that was the one big question that came up.
Yeah, I mean, again, for specific scores, you have to keep in mind doing cross-cultural research is very hard to do. It costs shit tons of money because you need to collect data from everywhere, and people don't fill out questionnaires for free most of the time. It costs time. The instruments need to be equal across different languages. That takes time. So you invest a lot of resources into doing this, and this is why there is not that much there. And so some of the country scores that I showed you, of course, if, for instance, the Schwartz data, the original run from 1992 and 1994, does not depend on representative samples. But now there are updates from the European Social Survey that you all can access that collects data. I think, again, it was every 2 or every 4 years. of European countries. And when I say European, it even includes Israel. So it's a quite far-stretched term of European countries where you have free access to, and you can see whether country scores change. So yeah, I hope that gives some explanations for why countries might score differently. Of course, it depends on what data was collected. But I think if it's for trainers or for volunteers for refugees, if you try to understand the culture, you want to work with it, what I can only recommend is use them in combination. Don't just say, here's Hofstede and we stop there. Use 5 and say, well, when we put it all together, how does the picture look like then? How can we make sense of the culture then? Yes, it's individualism, but then there's also a bit of looseness. Okay, so we can see individualistic interests there, maybe more behaviors are allowed. So we can create a more holistic picture of a social group rather than just focusing on one theory versus the other.
Yeah, I think it's also important or useful to see what different terms different academics or researchers use, which actually in the end mean more or less the same thing. And if you put those together, that can be helpful as well, although nothing is ever exactly the same.
Yeah, there is, luckily they often do this. I haven't talked about this here. So often in those big studies, they do look at how their dimensions relate to other dimensions. And there actually has been a recent paper this year where concepts from the World Value Survey, so the Ingela and Wells dimensions, the Hofstede dimensions, and I think Schwartz country level dimensions have all been put together to see, do they add up? Are they the same? They're not the same, but they create a holistic picture. So that is quite nice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. As we said earlier, the slides will be available on the SIETAR UK website tomorrow or the day after, and we'll probably have to tidy up the recording because I forgot to pause it while Katharina disappeared. But we'll try and sort that out, and we'll put that up as well.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming, for your patience while we solve the technical problems, which started even before you arrived, and wish everyone a happy, content summer break, and we'll see you in September.
I may also just stress again, if you have questions, comments you want to share, just email. I'm happy to send you things, to listen to your comments. I'm quite keen to hear what you have to say. If you think, okay, this is all well and good, what do I do with this for my specific, I don't know, work or task? Just get in touch. Maybe I can help and we can both make sense of it.
Did you put your email somewhere, Katharina? Was it at the end
on
of
the
the presentation?
It's on the slides as well.
On the slides. So we'll see them on the slides. Okay.
Yeah, I can put it in as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
So, good evening.